on the fact that we have both used, new, and rare books. So we spend a lot of time really carefully curating our shelves. And if you get the opportunity to look around up here or downstairs in our wonderful expanded poetry section, you'll notice that we spend a lot of time and care selecting the books and the authors that we include in our store. And of course, Indran has been a longtime friend of Lost City Books since we had just opened. So it's very, very nostalgic and happy to have you here again tonight. Finally, we're doing an event in person,
right.
for the first time.
We did so many virtual events, right?
A few things before we begin. If you purchased your book online through Eventbrite, take it home, check that off for you. Nextly, please silence your cell phones out of respect to our speaker this evening. As you can tell, it's very quiet in here, and that can get pretty disruptive. Nextly, on the subject of questions, if you have any questions or comments, please hold them until the end of our discussion, at which point we will have a Q&A and you can inquire to your heart's content. Speaking of your voice and questions, this event is being live streamed on Instagram and YouTube. And while none of you are visible, if you choose to ask a question later, that question will be a part of the live stream. So just be aware. All of the housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce Indran Amirthanayagam. Indran produced a world record in 2020, publishing 3 poetry collections written in 3 different languages. He writes in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Haitian Creole. He has published 22 poetry books, including Isleño, Blue Window, 10,000 Steps Against the Tyrant, The Migrant States, Coconuts on Mars, The Elephants of Reckoning, Uncivil War, and The Splintered Face, Tsunami Poems. I know that you are also a musician and a host of many other things, so I hope that we could talk about that as well. And again, my name is Shady Rose, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight. Please welcome Indran Amirthanayagam.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? You need the microphone? Okay. Thanks so much, Shady, for that lovely introduction. And it's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek to say a world record, but it's a self-appointed world record. Who really knows how many languages and how many books have been written at any one time? But
well,
it was a crazy year.
To set it first, right?
It's a crazy year, 2020, as we all know. My solution was to write and just write obsessively all the time.
Absolutely. And as I know you, you are quite a prolific writer, and you spend, I think, so much of your time, energy, spirit in your work, in the writing, and in writing in many languages. So I'm curious about, first, how your body of work kind of has taken shape as a part of your life, and also how this new translation work fits into that body of work.
Well, I mean, this was my first translation, and it's just like the first book I wrote, The Elephant's Reckoning, is a very special place for me because the experience of the first time I was bringing words from one language into another. And I was doing it with the poet, who was my close friend in Mexico City at the time. And so the translation mixed up with friendship, with learning each other's languages, he learning my English, my learning his Spanish, and the whole idea of crossing borders and borders between languages. He used to be quite. I mean, he knew English and he had studied at Yale. He'd done a PhD in Spanish literature at Yale, but English was not obviously his first language, and he couldn't translate himself. But because he knew English, my translating was. I had a sort of double value, and I could draw on his English, and we could sort of debate and discuss phrases. Something I miss because nowadays translation is a much more solitary thing for me. But back then, we would sit down over coffee at his home or my home or various places in Mexico City and look at the work, handwritten, at the time, or maybe it was on the computer, but it was a bit more rustic than it is today. And so there's a very special um, sharing that took place. And I think the work, I didn't realize at the time, but I mean, I was working with a very, very fine poet. I mean, Manuel last year. I mean, he was very close to Octavio Paz. He was sort of like like almost like a son to Paz. And he used to work on Welter, the magazine that Paz edited. And he was very close to many people. He was a very generous person. And his grandfather and grandmother were Manolo Altolaguirre and Concha Mendez, who were both poets of the generation of 27 in Spain, and Garcia Lorca and Alberti, and they were involved in the Spanish Civil War, and they became exiles from Spain after that terrible conflict, and which of course resulted in, among other things, the murder of Garcia Lorca. And they went first to Cuba and then to Mexico. And they separated, these are the grandparents. And then their daughter, Paloma, was Manuel's mother. And so Manuel was born, and then Luis Cernuda, who was a very fine poet in Spanish, also exiled from Spain during that Civil War, came to live in Mexico and lived in the same home, with Manuel and Manuel's mother. So what luck for Manuel, a teenage boy or growing up preteen, and consulting with Cernuda every day about life and about poetry. And in this book, there's a poem called Origami, para un día de lluvia, Origami for a rainy day, and there's an image of a boy at a window, and that comes from Cernuda, sort of looking at Manolo, as we used to call him, at his window. So if you have not read Cernuda, read Cernuda. In other words, reading Manuel or Manolo last year is an invitation to read others, to read Cernuda, to read the progenitors of this poetry, because it's such a beautiful, measured, verse, and it comes from the readings that Manuel did and the experiences he had with other poets, especially Luis Cernuda.
Thank you. So something that I believe that I would love to hear you expand on is typically works in translation can be a little clinical. Not often does it happen that the translator of the work is also a good friend of the author and has all of these insights to their, as you just said, to his history and to the social and emotional place where these poems, from whence the poems were written. So can you talk a little bit about how the familiarity and friendship of your relationship with Manuel allowed you to perhaps be a better translator for this work than if, say, this had been a poet from off the street?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I started writing in Spanish in Mexico City about 2 months after getting to Mexico City. I had written in French before, in Cote d'Ivoire. I've been a diplomat. I'm still connected to diplomacy. I'm not fully retired yet. And so that diplomacy gave me the chance to learn languages and learn them in very intense, deep ways. Anyway, I got to Mexico City and I started writing in Spanish. I wasn't afraid to cross over the border. And I've been a border crosser all my life, just the nature of my history, my family history. I'm a Tamil from an island called Ceylon. Now it's known as Sri Lanka. Ceylon no longer exists. So I've carried that story inside. And so crossing over the border of language was something that didn't scare me. But of course, I made lots of mistakes, and one or two people pointed those out to me and wondered, why are you doing this? You're a poet in English, stay in English. And I didn't listen, thankfully, to that advice. But Manuel himself was wondering about it. And he used to tell me, you have to choose English or Spanish, one point. But I crossed over, and once you cross the border, you can't go back. In a sense, you're two. you're not just one anymore. And for me, I became two in the sense of linguistically. I became Spanish or Latin American somehow, and English at the same time, and three with French, and maybe now four with Creole, and the other language, Portuguese, that I've since picked up. But my strongest languages are French, Spanish, and English, and I think and so Manuel. I think every experience is unique, and I think translating Manuel was obviously a unique experience. I mean, I became a friendship. He became a guide to me in Mexico City. He took me out to lunch shortly after I got there, and then friendship grew, and then tragedy also hit, because the last night I was in Mexico City when and literally our closest friends, about a dozen around the table. It was really like the Last Supper, I didn't know it at the time. Emmanuel was the host. And then 2 months later, I was here in Washington, in Rockville, and I got this terrible news that Emmanuel had passed. He had drowned in an accident near Zihuatanejo in Mexico. A riptide had pulled him away. And what was in the water on the beach were, curiously, relatives of Garcia Lorca, who were friends of his, I think the niece or something, Lorca's younger brother's daughter. Anyway, they happened to be vacationing with him there. Anyway, so I couldn't, and when that news came, I couldn't understand, because we were about to publish this book, these poems. It was going to come out at a press in Los Angeles 2 months later. And then once he died, the press gave up on the project. I mean, they didn't do anything with the book. And then all the sadness of the loss. And it took a long time for me to get over and try to find another public. And I did look, and I did publish some of the poems here and there. And some appeared in a book called Reversible Monuments, Contemporary Mexican Poetry, that same year, Copper Canyon. But this is a revised translation. I mean, in a sense, there are two new translations that I hadn't translated at the time. And I went over, of course, the ones that I had worked on with Manuel. And, the last thing he told me was, perhaps we have another hour or so to go through these. But we never actually quite had that hour, but I've had 20 years to revise them since, because the book has come out now, literally, 20 years later. So it's a very emotional experience, this book, for me, and the fact that it's come out. And the cover is done by Manuel's sister, Isabel Ulasi, was a photographer, visual artist. And I think she has made a beautiful image of a sort of origami, and that small world, that miniature captures. So there's a delicacy to Manuel's verse that I hope I've captured in the English. And as it's a bilingual book, you see the Spanish and the English from page to page and line to line. So you can hear for yourselves and decide for yourselves. And you don't need to know one language to read, obviously, because it's a bilingual. You can read it in Spanish or you can read it in English. But right now, this is the only book where the Spanish manual is easily available, because, after his death, there was a posthumous book published by Fondo de Cultura Económica in Mexico. That book is no longer in print, and, books go out of print, and time people forget. And so it's an emotional time to be able to reintroduce this poet, whom I think deserves a hearing, and so was really left us early, but he left us this very beautiful work. So I'm grateful to have the chance.
I have one more question, and then I think we can go ahead and start reading. But this is more about you and the way that your mind works. So as a polyglot, a diplomat, and a musician, and I'm sure many other things that I don't know about at this point, all of those kind of intersect in the dissecting of sound and time and moment. whether it's interpersonally and internationally, or in the turn of the tongue, and the way that it's here. I'm curious about how, over the course of your career as a poet, as a writer, and also knowing so many poets and so many different languages, how that has changed or adapted the way that you think about poetry and the way that you not only have translated this work, but the way that you write, not just in English, but in the other languages that you write with.
That is such a beautiful question. I love that dissecting of sound. Thank you for that. I mean, it's such a beautiful question. It has a sort of movement towards music, pure, whatever pure music of languages. I mean, poetry as a kind of word music, and that's where I've been going. And it's here in this book, and it's in my own poetry that I write. And I think there's a phrase, words and music of a song. When you think about Leonard Cohen or Bob Dylan or different. I mean, it's just a natural thing for me and also my own ear has been just trained, or it's trained itself over decades now of reading and listening. Listening, very important, saying the poem out loud. There was a time when I had to say the poem out loud before I wrote it down, or as I'm writing it down. And again, I have a bit of nostalgia for that, because now I might have developed some technique of being able to say it out loud silently to myself and be able to write it down without, and while somebody else is, doing something else, cooking or someone else, like that poem by Auden, Icarus is falling behind you, Musée de Boulessard, and people are having their breakfast or their lunch, unaware this huge event is going on behind you. Well, but no, word music, kind of music. And that's why when I wrote, for example, in Creole, when I was living in Haiti and I learned the language, and I'm grateful to my teachers, and the music I made was really, I was just a diseur, I was a speaker, I was a kind of a spoken word artist, but words come with music. I mean, I couldn't say that it's a dependent thing, when you are making songs, you need the music. And I love theater. I used to be in high school an actor, and that was my first experience with putting something out on stage, so the stage is the book or the page. But so all of these elements come together, and you do your best to give the poem the works, as Thomas would say when he would give his readings, and so you go to the entrails and you bring them out, and you cry and you weep and you shout hurrah, I mean, that's so the poem is a very living, vital thing for me, and just writing it and practicing this art over the years, just constantly reminded of how important it is. And it's, of course, it releases endorphins. It's like walking. It's an exercise that is good for you, writing and reading and exchanging. So, I don't know if it's such a bit of a question. There's so much one could say, yeah. So I guess it's a bit like Matisse, when Matisse at the end of his life would paint out these cutouts and these very bright colors. His hand was not able to do the sort of delicate definitions, but he still found the intensity somehow in those very bright colors at the end of his. So maybe that's where my poetry will go into a kind of, the intensity will be there, even if my hand, because it is the hand as well as the eye, as well as the ear. All of them are related, in the writing. Even if you use a computer, you still need the hand as well as the ear. And I listen to music when I'm writing often. I often listen on YouTube or something on the that. So I'm listening to, let's say, Joan Baez or Cohen or Dylan or whoever it is, and that helps inform the writing, you know. I think it's easier to write accompanied, whether it's your own music or music that you love.
I definitely understand. Thank you. And in a way, this translation is an accompaniment because your friendship and your knowledge and your experiences are accompanying Manuel's original words. So I think this would be a great time for you to read from the book.
Sure, thank you so much. I picked out a few poems just to give you an idea of the and I could read a couple of them also in the Spanish. Encuentros. Entregarte como la piedra al vértigo profundo de la noche. Caer y volver a estar donde estuvimos. Ser los mismos y ser otros, como si todo otra vez fuera nuevo. El tren que pasa, la ventana azul, mi cuerpo desnudo junto al tuyo, llenos de amor en un cuarto vacío. Encounter. Give yourself like a stone to the deep vertigo of night. Fall and return to be where we once were. Be the same and yet be others, as if everything were new again. The passing train, the blue window, my body naked against yours, filled with love in an empty room. Tenochtitlan blues. Cae la tarde y termina tu viaje. Mañana cuando te marches te buscaré en el vacío que dejaste por todas partes. Y si el día es claro, tal vez alcance a ver los volcanes siempre cubiertos de nieve, como el silencio que envuelve a dos cuerpos que se miraron sin tocarse siquiera. Tenochtitlan blues. Evening falls and you finish your trip. Tomorrow when you go, I will look for you in the emptiness you left everywhere. And if the day is clear, perhaps I may get to see the two volcanoes forever covered with snow, like the silence that envelopes two bodies that gazed at each other without even touching. If you know Mexico City, you know those two volcanoes that you look out on, Popocatépetl, and I always mispronounce the and you know, Manuel was a great traveler. I mean, he traveled, he had the opportunity to travel, and he went to India, he traveled in Europe, and he traveled in the Arab world. And some of these, I'll read you a poem now called, I'll just read the English in this case, The Supper. The blues on fire, moving constantly, crash, agree, and liquefy. An orange sun still lights the terrace, the clay of the road, the cypress cups, the city below in a hollow valley. A white tide of lights that grows while night thickens the wood. Around the table, friends eat and talk, attend a double feast, one that occurs up there in the firmament, celestial choreography in which the day flees and which the dialogue creates. In the silence between two words, a cricket sings. The emanation of a star sparkles far away. Another light shines in the eyes of those who hear and contemplate. Echo of the echo of the echo. Star, song, and flame. Only the poem writes itself. So that was La Cena, supper. Let me see, Arabian Nights. Shall we try? Yeah. Now, Arabian Night spelled the night K-N-I-G-H-T. Los montes, los olivos, los campos de verdura en el valle, los altos muros ocres del Palacio Real de la Medina, la brisa de la noche, la voz del muezzin lejana, monótona, el café de siempre y sus parroquianos. Sentado en la terraza del jardín, el Jabul en Meknes, un muchacho moreno vestido con una chilaba blanca, después de largo rato, después de consumir el té de menta que había ordenado,
Se acerco a ti para saber de dónde venías. Y mientras te contaba la historia del lugar, pelo un higo maduro con una navaja que desenvainó de golpe. El reflejo del farol sobre la hoja tocó tu rostro. 3 gotas de leche se derramaron por entre sus dedos. Al ver que lo mirabas, sus pupilas se dilataron como las de un tigre. Entonces partió el higo, fluorescencia cargada de semilla que parecían arder en la bóveda. Y enseguida llevó una de las vitales a tu boca y otra con gesto ágil a la suya. Cuánto placer al degustar la fruta, cuánto vértigo en el filo de la hora. La sangre se hizo espesa, los sentidos se abrieron a otro tiempo. De pronto sentiste sobre tu pie su babucha y sin decir palabra te fuiste con él por las calles de la Medina. Arabian Nights. Mountains, olive trees, vegetable fields in the valley. The high ochre walls of the royal palace in the old city, the night breeze, the muezzin's voice, far away, monotonous, the usual cafe and its parishioners. Sitting on the terrace of the garden of El Habul in Meknes, a dark youth wearing a white jalaba, after a long while, after drinking the mint tea he had ordered, approached you to learn from where you came. And while he told you the history of that place, he peeled a ripe fig with a knife. He drew suddenly. The reflection of the street lamp on the blade touched your face. 3 drops of milk spilled on his fingers. When he noticed your gaze, his pupils dilated like a tiger's. Then he divided the fig, the flowering filled with seeds that seemed to burn in the vault of the night, and immediately put one half in your mouth and the other with an agile flick in his own. What pleasure in tasting the food! What vertigo on the edge of the hour! Blood thickened, the senses opened up to another time. Suddenly, you felt his slipper touch your foot, and without a word, you went with him through the streets of the old city. Thank you. I hadn't read that poem out loud before, so it was a second time.
Thank you. Of course, those were so beautiful. And as you started talking about earlier, these poems have a dusky, ephemeral, slightly erotic quality to them. And I'm curious about, as you were working with Manuel and also working on this translation over time, what are some of your impressions of this collection in terms of who do you think it's for? You know, what does it touch? What did it touch within you as you were translating it, and what do you see it touching in others as more people have the opportunity to read?
Well, you know, Manuel had a long-term relationship with a poet. His name is Horacio Costa, and that relationship ended. And Manuel was quite sad about the end of the relationship. If you read the poem Origami for a rainy day, that's dedicated to Horacio. And it's an important, but Manuel had a great talent, which I've always admired. You don't find it very often. This talent for the long poem, whatever that long means, and it's more than 2 pages, it goes on, and he pulls it off. And he did it in Origami, and he did it in El Pato Azul, the Blue Plate, which is in this book as well. So I think that's just a talent he has, and he shows it here. You know, yes, there is an eroticism. I mean, I chose some poems to read that reflect that. I mean, when I was reading him, I think I was reading Cavafy, you know, and I was reading Sanuda, and I learned about Sanuda through reading Manuel. So it's like a touchstone. You touch something, and then you reveals another truth underneath it. And so there's a richness to that experience. But Manuel was a poet, yes, of desire. He is a poet of desire and, you know, sad melancholy, but he's also you know what? Sometimes one wonders what would he have been writing. I mean, he was also engaged in pen, you know, and he used to write letters to prisoners, you know, around the world. And he was the president of the pen committee in Mexico in the last months of his life. He had just taken on that job, so he was a committed in that sense. I mean, he of course the whole history of the Spanish Civil War, but I, you know, whether you write 20 books or one book, you know, if you can create a music that is yours, that is special, that is like, I mean, in other words, you can't mass produce it. It's a gift. Each poem is a unique thing. And Manuel has that for me. Yes, I think of Cavafy, yes, I think of Saluda, but I don't think these are copies or something. They evoke and invoke these other great poets. And so I've started to call Manuel a great poet. What does great mean? It means it moves me deeply, it transforms me. I feel somehow like a change utterly, you know, a terrible beauty is born. That's a line from Yeats, but I think of that sense of being transformed, suffused. You know, he's a human being. He had his strengths, he had his limitations, like all of us. And, but that's the friendship, and that's the personal. I am so grateful that this book now exists, even though he has gone on. Perhaps he's somehow aware that these poems are circulating again, and in some cases for the first time. You know, I don't know where the book will go, but it's and we are on Earth a brief space to learn to bear the beams of love. That's, you know, William Blake, and this black body is in the sunburned face is but a cloud and like a shady grove. And in that poem, The Little Black Boy, Blake talks about you from your white cloud being freed, and he from his black cloud being freed, and then round the tent of God like lambs with joy. I mean, when I read Manuel, I think of being, you know, dropping the shackles, dropping the prohibitions, just accepting the beauty of the love that he expresses. And so if that's a growing up to me too, because when I met Manuel, I'm sure I was perhaps less expansive, less inclusive, less. So in a sense, maybe getting wiser, if I have gotten wiser, is getting more understanding and translating Manuel, and now read sort of living Manuel's poems. Again, this book is part of that. Anyway, I'm just grateful that they've had it. And you know, sometimes you wonder, because as you know, poetry publishing not easy, and you can. I mean, I've become now a publisher actually, Beltway Editions. It's a new project with the poet Sarah Cahill Barron. We're editing books we've published 3 years. So I think you give back and you engage. So poetry is not dead. Despite what I understand, there was a New York Times article that made the argument. I didn't see the article yet, but no. And Manuel is not dead, but poems are living, and that's the great thing.
Well, that's something I was going to ask is about the aliveness of a person. You know, it could be argued that all the notable signs that we exist are reflected in how and if other people receive and perceive us. And so do you think that through this collection and through poetry, through writing in general, that a person who has passed on from this world can remain alive in some sense? And if so, do you feel that this work helps to do that for Manuel?
Yeah, I mean, you leave a trace in the heart and the memory, you know. As I said, it's almost like polishing a stone. You just touch the stone and it shines, you know. So it's a sort of magic. Obviously, this is not a rational argument. This is absolutely spiritual argument that these poems are living, breathing, and when you recite them or read them, or of course, I have my personal memories of that time in Mexico City or Manuel, but I hope that they invoke for the reader his or her own youth and foibles and passions and sadnesses. And so there's a communion coming together. It's almost when you eat the communion bread, you're symbolically eating the flesh of Christ, right? And you're drinking, or if you take the blood, with the wine and you're drinking it. So it's that kind of feeling of commingling, of communion. So it's very intimate, and it's I mean, the poem is, I hope I'm not being sacrilegious, say it's a sort of a like mass, right? It's a kind of ceremony with these. I grew up in the Catholic tradition, so I'm aware of the ceremony. And I remember where Manuel used to live, Francisco Sosa, in the city, there's a chapel near on that street. And that's where the Malinche used to go and worship. La Malinche was the person who was the sort of, in the history of Mexico with Cortez. And she's an interesting character in history. But I mean, to actually see the church there, it's quite something. Origami itself, the concept of origami, like this paper world, this miniature world, delicate world, and yet it has the solidity. It's captured somehow in this book. So so maybe we don't have to build monuments, we can write little delicate poems, and that will be enough to be remembered. We don't have to create huge, or we don't have to become billionaires. So we can just concentrate on making something beautiful during the time that you are on the planet and sharing that. And I think Manuel has done that. And so and I hope the book will live on beyond this time. We'll see.
Yes. Well, you touch the stone and the stone touches you, right? So I believe that's true. One more, I think we can open it up to the floor. And I want to talk a bit about your other published works, your original poetry, and some of the things that you like to explore. I know that you touched on a lot of different topics, and sometime recently here at Lost City Books, we had you join us for Blue Window. And I noticed earlier in one of the poems that you read, the phrase Blue Window was mentioned. I'm curious about whether or not that is a coincidence or whether or not those two are actually connected.
I remember. I noticed that myself, but I think perhaps I got the phrase "Blue Window" in Indran Amirthanayagam from that poem of Manuel's, back in the day, because in 1999, Blue Window had not been written. I wrote Ventana Azul, the original book in Spanish, many years later, and it must have somehow stayed deeply in my memory. And I thought, so I credit it to Manuel now, but I didn't even know when I wrote the phrase that I had forgotten that it had come from it. But anyway, the idea of the blue window. Yeah, and my own poetry, I have a lot of love poems, and I have a book in French called Sur l'île nostalgique, about that, on that nostalgic island, it's really a good love poems. When I say love in a very broad sense, not only romantic love, but it's a love for the culture and history that's gone, that you want to get back somehow, or recreate in the book, in the poems. Uncivil War, my book about Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan history, the history of that very uncivil war that lasted more than 20 years and marked my life and marked the lives of so many people. So I wanted to tell that history in poetry. Now, some of those poems are very, so to speak, public poems, they're sort of political poems about war and peace and bombings and things. But then there are also poems that are very interesting personal. When my grandmother falls on the floor from the shaking, that happens because a bomb went off not far away. And so the whole house shook. And so she shook and she fell. And seeing her fall in front of me, the impact on me, I wrote the poem and used that image. So, and my grandmother, who was taught by Irish nuns, many years earlier. And so the Irish question was very much the Tamil question for me, the Tamil minority question, and the Irish rebellion and the search for. So when I read Gates on Easter 1916, I'm also reading my own history, and I'm thinking. So, my other books, yes, there's a lot of politics in them. I mean, the latest book, 10,000 Steps Against Tyrant. Now, that orange-haired tyrant is the one who inspired that book. And who was making these 10,000 steps? Who was wheeling the democracy? It was very much a book written in the 2020 campaign against that tyrant. But I think the poems survived. They applied again with these midterms we just went through. And I go back to the poems, and I'm grateful because yes, you always wonder, are you writing too topically? And will the poem make sense 6 months later or 6 years later? And I think they do. I mean, time will tell. That book came out early 2022. And it's the last book that I've written in my own poems. And prior to that, there was a book called The Migrant State, which I have a copy of here. Migrant states. I mean, I'm playing on the migrant stating and the notion of the migrant states, the United States. And then Walt Whitman is a character in that book. And Walt Whitman is speaking to the poet throughout the book, the different poets. So Walt Whitman, the sort of iconic American poet who we've all read at some point or come across through school. And Walt Whitman, on his 200th birthday, I write a poem for his 200th birthday. And so I'm in dialogue with Whitman. I'm in dialogue with American culture, which is my new culture, the culture of my adopted country. And I mean, I'm very proud about this. I mean, the country that has adopted me gave me the chance to be its representative abroad, which is a great honor, I think. Not many countries, if any, give a first-generation migrant the chance to represent it. And that's something I'm very grateful for and proud of. But that said, I'm not saying there isn't racism in this country and there isn't sexism and there isn't all these. But it's a democracy that's perfecting itself or trying, And Sonia Sancho would say, in America we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, And there's a sort of constant. So the 2 steps forward, I think, is happening with this rejection of the sort of the craziness. I mean, that assault on the Capitol. Just today, I wrote a poem where I ended up including this image of this assault on the Capitol from January of 2021, right? And then I thought of that assault, and then I thought about my own history, or the history of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, where there were assaults on Tamil homes and businesses. People used voting lists, and with the voting list, you knew if the family was a Tamil or a Sinhalese or a Muslim, and you could identify and go and torch that particular home. And I was thinking of the image of the Capitol being torched or attacked. So for me, it's very real, I think, for all of us. I mean, the assault on democracy can happen anywhere, and it's happened here. And that's a subject for poetry. blowing in the wind. Bob Dylan wrote that song. He later said, he didn't know why so many people interpreted so many things from it, but he wrote it, and it's still relevant today as it was when it was written. So you just have to write about what you feel in your heart, what you know from, and interpret. I mean, this week, Pope Benedict, there's the passing of Benedict, and then Pele. And I was thinking, what are the different legacies of these two? And is it a subject for a poem? And I wrote a poem called The First Week or something about this week. I don't know if it's a successful poem, but I have admiration for some things, but also criticism of some things relating to Benedict. But in terms of Pele, I'm pretty much all admiration for all the things that he did, and the barriers he broke down and crossed over. He's like a hero, like Nelson Mandela or others. So, but they're both human beings, and they passed on. So respect for the passing. And I saw the funeral in the Vatican. I woke up at 3 a.m. It was on, just watching. It was quite interesting to see the spectacle of that, and the maleness of it, because mostly priests, thousands, but not, women too, and nuns and women and ordinary people. But it's just interesting to read these things and try to interpret them poetically. I haven't written that poem about the funeral, but I'm just saying everything that happens in the world, whether you see it on television, you read it, or you experience it yourself, is for me material for poetry. I don't think that poetry exists only, to do, with the old line about art for art's sake or something. It's not. It's art for art's sake. It's art for politics' sake. It's a language that's useful in the debate. In my book, 10,000 Steps, you'll find poems about the Gettysburg Address of Biden and so on. I mean, this is, to me, the material for poetry. So I keep writing often in a place called the New Verse News, which publishes poems on topical themes. I write a poem in French once a week in a Haitian newspaper, and a poem in Spanish in the Dominican paper. The Spanish one is available on the internet. So I'm just saying, sometimes those poems are very personal. Sometimes they're responding to some political event or tragedy, and inevitably war. War, whether it's the war in Ukraine or, I've written, respond to it. I'm not prejudiced in the sense that, or elitist about poetry. I think poetry is like eating or sleeping. It's essential and it's just natural. So I don't make a distinction that, this is a poem that should go into the New York Review of Books, or this is for the Paris Review. There's no borderline for me. All material is potentially, and when I edit poetry at the Beltway Poetry Quarterly, which is a digital magazine, I and Sarah and Renee we all edit the poems. I think we have that openness to poetry, but I do have I must say, a certain penchant for the music of words and language, and so if the poem doesn't move me to dance mentally or to literally move my step by feet, perhaps I'll be less interested in it than if it did. So in that sense, I do. I think about Ezra Pound talking about the relationship between dance and music and the word, and when you break those links, it all sort of comes crashing down. So if you can dance the poem, if you can make music with the poem, sing it, that's sort of the perfect poem. But then, Bob Lax once wrote a poem called 108 Years Old Today, and not one perfect poem written, all in one vertical line, So and Yeats writes at the end, he's like, what then, So in other words, you're always trying to achieve this perfection, but then some voice telling you, what then? What's next? What? So it's a human limitation. Right? We're not God, so you think like Widogo that you're a small God. The Pequeño Dios, sort of the poet is a little creator. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Please. Thank you. I know that I personally deeply appreciate your poetic interpretations of the Origami. And I feel honored to know you and to have the opportunity to speak with you tonight. And I'm sure that many people here tonight feel the same. And on that note, it's your turn, people here tonight. If you would like to ask some questions or offer comments, now's the time. And the same goes for you all watching at home. Feel free to leave a comment, and we will get to that at the end as well.
Since the gestation of the translations were over decades, were there any poems, any words, any lines that the original translation 20 years later is different? The original lines changed, the meaning changed?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I mean, there were some changes, but not many. They survived that time. But I did two very absolutely new translations. One is the poem River. Sorry, River. There's one translation by Suzanne Jill Levine, which she kindly agreed to republish in the book. And I remember she had done the translation when Manuel was alive, and I didn't want it. So I didn't. Sorry, the poem "The Stone in the Depths" Piedra del Fondo is a new translation, and the River is Suzanne Jill Levine's poem translation. Wonderful translation. Yeah, I mean, there were certain small changes, and then also there were two sort of tribute poems to Manuel that I've written here. One I wrote about 10 years ago, and the other just before publishing this book. And so those are also in the book. I was wondering about whether to touch these up, because I also had a sense of they were so sacred for me. You know, they belonged to that relationship, that time. Manuel passed away. Maybe that hour I shouldn't do anything in that hour, you know, because somehow it's like playing with something that's already. And so I had to work myself through that and say, well, no, I mean, every poem can be improved with revision and translation, revision. Sometimes you can do too much. You have to know where to stop. So I think I definitely went through every one of these again and was satisfied, felt satisfied. I also shared them with a couple of people, and eventually enough to be confident that now was the time. And then when I sent them to the publisher, you know, they accepted. He had published me once before with the book Go Into so the new my work. I'm grateful for that. Go lab and do this books. So yeah. So but it's funny about how much time. I mean, 20 years is an amazing amount of time, actually. Somehow it doesn't seem like 20 years, but it's really a lot. So that's why time is very strange, isn't it? I mean, 20 years or a day, and yet, when you see an old friend, you know, you may not have seen for years, but it's as if you had those years didn't exist. And then I keep in touch, of course, with Manuel's sister, especially Isabella, who did the cover. And I saw her recently, and I went to Mexico City. And I carried some copies of the book for her and her mother. And so that was a special thing also to be able to bring the book there. And, thank you. Yes, yes.
I was also wondering about the process of interpretation, whether there were times where you had to choose between words that meant the same thing but had a different feeling attached to them? And then how does your own personal experience sort of combining all of these intersecting disciplines, music, languages, diplomacy, influence your choice in that regard?
Somehow, the more complex one makes one, like maybe it's a challenge that it forces you to sort of clarify, and go to the essence. So it's an advantage for me to go into French or to go into Creole and then come back into English. I'm somehow emboldened and strengthened from that experience outside of English, coming back into the language. So, perhaps I would not feel as strong in English if I had not made those trips out, and engaging with the other languages during the course of the day. I've had these crazy days where I've written, a poem in each of the languages, and it's a rush. Yes, it's a certain kind of, but it's also, I think, beneficial. The coming back, you feel refreshed. I sometimes say I may be tired in one language, but absolutely, raring to go in the other. So that's the one advantage of having access to different languages. You can less rest in one, or maybe I can write the poem in Spanish, or maybe I can only write it in English. It just depends what. But there's a very thing about Latinate words as opposed to Anglo-Saxon words, and a very simple thing. So you do have these choices to make in terms of how to bring the poem from Spanish into English. And I think I veered in the original with Manuel more to the Latinate, but then I think in the revision, more of the Anglo-Saxon choices came up, at least in the earlier. Well, it's hard to know where to go, because you want to respect the original, and in the Spanish, the Latinate word dominates, and yet it's a new music, it's a different music in English. And so you have to find the balance. You have to make it new and yet respect what it was. And that's a very delicate thing. And from poem to poem, one has to see, does the translator do it? Alistair Reid used to translate Neruda, and Neruda would tell him, "You've improved me in English." I was like, what a compliment, And Neruda knew English. He actually lived in Ceylon, where I'm from, and then went and read books. So, but then if you read Neruda's translation, there's so many different translators and different registers. So I have my personal favorites, and Alistair Reid is one of them. And he's one of the models I've learned from, actually, as a translator. Reid used to tell me he would wake up in the morning and limber up, almost like physical exercise. He would translate 5 or 6 poems, and then he would go on with his writing day. He lived from writing. He wrote to the New Yorker. He made his living from, but the translations was sort of his breakfast, his first, even before breakfast, he would work, and then he would go on. So, you learn. It's not, I haven't studied formally poetry in the sense of taking an MFA or something. Not that I used to be nervous about that. I thought if you did workshop the poem, you would lose some of your originality, or you somehow. I don't think so now. I think that's one thing where I've matured, in the sense. I think the MFA is fine. Having a workshop is good. Having interchange with others and getting opinion. But I'm more of a sort of a guru learner, So my guru was Allen Ginsberg, for example, when I was younger, and I had a chance to get to know him. And then it was Alistair Reid. I learned from just spending time with these poets and learning. For example, Neruda, Ginsberg once took a poem of mine, and my first poem was almost my first poem, my second or third poem as a teenager, and he sort of cut out half of it and said, he said, this is what he does with everybody. Hard for me to believe that he would cut out half the first draft to read Ginsberg's poem. But that's what that lesson stayed with me, to be severe in the revision.
And Alistair Reid once with a poem of mine, he suggested removing the last two lines, and it made the poem night and day. I'll recite it to you. The way after Reid's translation, I don't remember now those two lines, but I remember the poem as edited by Reid. You must love, it's called. You must love the land when you leave to build your house in the sea. Love what's lost, the mango tree burning in the garden, the curious noose of the familiar coat of arms. Love the ball turning strong, spinning in a dark, faraway land. Love the tongue you'll never again speak, that wrapped you and bled you and dried up some every day on the other side of the sea. How interesting, that's a poem about the loss of a language, and I acquired other languages, but I lost the language that's very important, which is Tamil, the language I spoke as a child. Well, I spoke Sinhalese too, but I really lost them, or they've been blocked out somehow, psychologically. My migration has been towards languages, but it's also involved the loss of languages. And maybe the loss of the languages inspired the sort of manic, passionate desire to acquire the new languages, the languages of America, languages, the, so to speak, new world. Anyway, it's my own psychological approach. And I hope, like Roger Casement, I could go back and maybe I can learn Tamil. Casement was, in his case, he was an English speaker who learned or was learning Gaelic. And if you know Mario Vargas Llosa, he wrote a novel called El Sueño del Celta, the Celts, Sueño del South, yeah, the Dream of the South. And that's about this Irishman, Roger Casement. Anyway, it's another story, but politics and engaging with politics is part of my interest as a human being as well. So poetry is my way.
One more?
Yes, please.
So you kind of mentioned the connection between, or the similarity between religion and poetry and the ceremony of it, and the way that it helps interpret things in the world that's beautiful. And I'm curious, especially someone mentioned that article about poetry being better. I'm curious what you see as the role of poetry in today's world, especially as religions less adopted. If they should step into that role, but just generally, it's what you see.
I think it does step into there. I mean, it's a kind, as I mentioned, a sort of lake mass. It's a sort of a civil ceremony. As opposed to the religious ceremony. But it's a ceremony. And it's an exchange, There's the muse, and the muse is a goddess or a god or something, some kind of sacredness to that, devotion to the muse and the bringing of offerings to the muse. So the poet brings poems to feed the muse, to respond to the muse's needs. You bring offerings to the temple, flowers or food, and you leave them there. I mean, I'm thinking of Hindu temples where people bring. But I mean, so the notion of offering, the notion of ceremony, of exchange, of a kind of illumination coming from the writing and the exchange, healing. I mean, writing poetry and reading poetry for me is related to releasing of endorphins, of a kind of healing, psychological, emotional healing. So it's very much. It's very, I don't know if without poetry where I would be. I don't quite. That's also a danger, a dependence. You don't want to become too dependent on one thing. You want to be able to open it and close the book. Once I open this book of poetry, it just stays open, and I have to feel. Like today, for example, I wrote the poem before coming here, and I felt this compulsion to write something. Is that a healthy compulsion? I mean, I wasn't smoking my way out of on the way. So maybe it's not unhealthy. Maybe it's okay. The poem itself may not be that good if you feel compelled to do it. But no, I do think of poetry and poetry readings in the way, I feel blessed by them. Now, these words, blessed, when you feel blessed by the ceremony of the Mass, so you feel, so in that sense, yes, it's a spiritual language that I use, but I'm not talking about strictures or, thou shalt nots or something. I'm thinking of just a choice to engage with the book. The book, I mean, the notion of the book, right? The holy book, right? Or the unholy book. Should read Ginsburg. I mean, it's there. It's a book, and it has some kind of special power because of because the poems have been gathered in this form. So yeah, definitely, it's for me that, and that's why it's wonderful that you make this happen here, this exchange, and you make it available to those who can't be here in person through YouTube. So I think we need to go more to the physical. We need to get away from the virtual. So I've certainly done a lot of virtual things, and I see that I do a YouTube channel, right? So that's virtual in a sense. But yeah, no, lovely question, and I'm fully with you on that. I think, after all, I think the first poems, I mean, they were sung around the fire, and they perhaps this is my they somehow told the stories of the adventures outside, but and they kept the history of the family and the community alive through the poem. So you wrote them for you an oral art, and you shared it with others. Then it became a written art, but the written art, like this book, can be touched, and the voice comes out. And that's what's so beautiful about the book. Right?
Well, thank you so much, Indran, for sharing this book with us and for continuing the work of keeping the word and the spirit alive. So I just want to give you a round of applause and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So thank all of you for joining us tonight. Feel free to mingle and chat and grab your copy of the book. Just so that you know, however, the store closes in 15 minutes. That's the time limit. So you can sign.
Oh yeah. I'm sure I have one, but I don't think it's very good. I have one actually.
Thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you.
Listening to you.
And take it down to. We can get it signed first.